Let me be clear. There is absolutely no doubt that this decision was taken in large part because of regulatory uncertainty and endless delays created by the national government, as well as the general atmosphere of lawlessness that we have seen take hold parts of our country and much of our economic infrastructure in the past 3 weeks.
Teck Resources has announced it's walking away from its proposed $20 billion oil sands mine in northern Alberta. The federal cabinet was supposed to either approve or reject the project this week. Now it doesn't have to make that call. Here's the company's CEO explaining their decision.
The project has landed squarely at the nexus of a much broader national discussion on energy development, Indigenous reconciliation, and of course climate change. And so we are stepping back to allow Canada to have this important discussion without a looming regulatory deadline for just one project.
So what will the province do in response? Jason Nixon is Alberta's Environment Minister. He joins us from the legislature in Edmonton. Hi, Minister Nixon. Thanks for making time for us.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to start off with the decision from the Alberta Court of Appeal. It has just not long ago, I think about an hour ago, ruled in favor of your province, calling the federal carbon tax unconstitutional. But the letter from Teck's CEO announcing it was no longer pursuing the frontier mine said this, quote, "We are strong supporters of Canada's action on carbon pricing and other climate policies, such as legislated caps for oil sands emissions." Is this the wrong fight for your government to be pursuing?
No, I think this is the exact right fight for our government to be pursuing. We're excited about the court ruling today. We think that it reiterates what Alberta's point has been for a long time, that constitutionally we have a right to develop our own resources and to manage these issues right here in the province of Alberta. Both the Premier and I have been clear that we believe that Alberta has an obligation to manage emissions and to work on climate change. But the argument comes in that we feel that we should be allowed to do that our way. Our focus is on technology. Our focus is on working with our industry, on being a leader on this important file. And the federal government continues to want to tax hockey moms and hockey dads in the province of Alberta. We're glad that the Court of Appeal has ruled with us today, and we're calling on the federal Liberal government to immediately remove their carbon tax from our economy.
The phrase that you just used, the federal government wants to attack hockey moms and hockey dads. When I read this letter from Teck's CEO, what jumped out at me was the sort of presentation of the idea that there is so much acrimony between all levels of government and so much sort of space between various positions that they don't want to be caught in the middle of it all, and that's what they felt they were. When you make a comment like that, doesn't your government bear some responsibility for that level of acrimony?
No, I disagree completely with that. First of all, my conversations with Teck over the weekend and in the last few weeks, not once did Teck bring up climate change management with us during any of those conversations. So I focus primarily on what Teck has talked about with me, which was the regulatory uncertainty, which we've been pointing out for a long time. When the federal government's going to create a situation where a big company like Teck coming in to invest that magnitude inside an economy can't get regulatory certainty, this is what you're going to end up with in the end. They also pointed out public safety issues and that they were concerned about what's been taking place in our country over the last week and a half or so. But the reality is, when it comes to climate change, Alberta has taken action. We've brought in the Technology Innovation Emission Reduction Program. We're projecting 57 megatons of reduction by 2050 as a result of that program. That's real clear results. And from our perspective in Alberta, we don't think taxing everyday Albertans for driving and heating their homes is the way to solve this problem. We're focused on the industry. We're focused on making sure that we can do what we have to do that way and actually have actual results.
So you're saying that no one from Teck ever talked about the sort of tensions between, the tension in the conversation between pursuing resource development and pursuing the fight against climate change, because this letter goes on in detail about it. At Teck, we believe deeply in the need to address climate change and believe that Canada has an important role to play. None of that was ever conveyed to you?
No, when we talked with Teck, the primary concerns that they wanted our help with were around other environmental issues, primarily habitat issues and species at risk issues that we've talked about many times on your show. The reality is, though, I don't disagree with Teck, and Alberta agrees that we have an obligation to deal with climate change. Where the dispute between the federal and provincial government is on how to deal with that. Alberta will deal with it our way. We will regulate our industry. We're not going to let a federal government who continues to show themselves to be anti-energy, anti-oil and gas, just have a say on our regulatory framework if that means that there's there's no future for things like our oil sands and our energy industry. Alberta will handle this our way, and our Court of Appeal agrees with us today that that is our constitutional right and quite frankly our obligation. So we're going to continue to fight to make sure that we can have made in Alberta solutions, not Justin Trudeau solutions inside this province.
What is rhetoric directed towards and against the federal government like that? What does it accomplish?
The point is this, is from Alberta's perspective, that we have a right to do this. We believe that we are doing it better, that we are handling this issue better, we're getting better results than my predecessor's program. 57 megatons is a significant amount of emission reduction, and that the way forward is not to tax everyday Albertans or Canadians for that matter, but is to focus on developing technology and making big emission reductions throughout that process, not again hurting people who are just trying to heat their homes or drive their cars.
I get the argument that you're putting forth. I'm not trying to take away from that, but the rhetoric that you're using, you're saying the federal government wants to attack hockey dads and hockey moms, that they're anti-energy. You're using rhetoric that will inflame, could inflame the sentiment behind so much of the acrimony that exists right now that Teck pointed to as, we're talking about these protests that you say, that is an issue, the uncertainty when it comes to what they'll be able to pursue because of that, right? The federal government bears some responsibility for sure for that as well, but does your government not too, given the kinds of rhetoric that you're using right now? Aren't you further inflaming things?
No, I'm not going to ever apologize for defending the people of Alberta who elected this government to do just that. The rhetoric that you say I'm saying is what Albertans feel. Albertans have hired us to do a job. One of it was to fight the carbon tax. That we fulfilled that promise within the province of Alberta with Bill number 1 of this government to replace the Alberta carbon tax, to remove the Alberta carbon tax, I should say. And we will continue to fight the federal government to make sure that they don't put a carbon tax on our economy and on the people that we represent, because that's what Albertans want. What I'm articulating to you is what Albertans feel. And we're going to continue to fight for our rights within this province. Now, to be clear though, we see an obligation within our province to manage climate, to manage emissions, and we're going to continue to move forward and do that in our way. We think we're having better success, quite frankly, than the federal government, and we'll continue to focus on that because that's the future. That's the way out of this problem, is to focus on technology, not to go out of your way to shut the oil and gas industry, which from our perspective is what the federal government is trying to do.
Minister, with the greatest of respect, if that fight doesn't get anything built, what's the point?
Well, again, as the Premier said today in his comments, we will take action to get things built. If the federal government continues to block it through the regulatory process, we will do whatever we need to in the end to be able to get our infrastructure built, to be able to get our product to market. We'll have more to say about it in the coming days, but we have been clear for weeks. We will defend the province of Alberta. We call on the federal government to work with us. We see a path forward where we can work together on emissions. I was pretty clear last week. We were willing to have conversations around caps and different ways that we could have a partnership on that going forward. But if this is going to be the process, that they're going to continue to derail our regulatory process and put things in our way that stop us from being able to succeed, we will do what we have to do to defend the province of Alberta.
Okay, Minister, thank you very much for your time as always. Jason Nixon, Alberta's Environment Minister.
Thanks for having me on.
From Edmonton.
Oil and gas projects are being built all over the world right now, just not in Canada under his watch. The reason is this Liberal government.
The member's office continue to refuse to understand the world is changing, that you can no longer build a strong economy if you are not fighting climate change at the same time.
These decisions are a repudiation of his policies. What else was Teck Frontier supposed to do to get a project built in this country, Mr. Speaker?
It is the Conservative Party polarizing the debate on climate change that is putting our economy at risk.
Reaction there, heated reaction to Teck Resources' decision to withdraw their Frontier oil sands mine project. It came swiftly and it was predictable on all sides. What does Teck's decision say about future development of oil sands in Canada, and how much responsibility do the entrenched political positions carry when companies decide to drop potential projects? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in. In Calgary, executive producer of CBC News in Calgary and host of the political podcast West of Centre, Kathleen Petty. Brandy Morin, journalist and contributor with CBC Indigenous, joins us from Edmonton. Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs is in Toronto. Over in Montreal, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister Yolande James, and Tim Powers of Summa Strategies joins us from St. John's. Supersized panel. Hi, everybody. Hello. Nice to see you. Kathleen, I'm going to start with you because this also comes the decision came last night, but then about an hour and a half ago, another big decision in Alberta, this one from the Alberta Court of Appeal. We've just been speaking about it on the show with both the federal and provincial ministers of the environment. What is your take on how things are going down there? A lot to process.
Oh, man, I'm just trying to catch my breath, actually, if I'm being perfectly honest, because I listened to Jason Kenney's speech and then news conference, and I sort of couldn't keep up with the news that he was making. I mean, the reaction was obvious, and he started with what he would consider the good news, which is that they won in a 4-1 decision in the Alberta Court of Appeal, and it was a pretty interesting ruling. The language, constitutional Trojan horse, is what 3 of the 5 justices referred to the consumer carbon tax as. So it obviously fuels, no pun intended, his ongoing fight, anticipating the Supreme Court. And it does fit into the narrative, I think we can all agree, around Teck as well, that he would argue that the leadership has been, from the federal government, has been damaging. It helped, it led to this decision or lack thereof, decision by Teck, lack of decision by Ottawa. And I found it interesting, he mentioned conversations actually that he had with Don Lindsay, the CEO of Teck, on the weekend, on Saturday and Sunday. And he went on to say, it's clear to me what happened was this: the federal government let Teck know that there would not be a yes-no decision on the application this week, but rather it would be deferred to some point in the future. So now, I'd not heard that before. And I would add, he also wouldn't rule out the idea of direct government investment in Teck. Sound familiar?
It does sound familiar, something like the federal government and TMX. I would just say that we asked Minister Wilkinson about, I didn't know that Premier Kenney had said that because I was on air at the time, but I did ask Minister Wilkinson if they were going to make a decision this week, and he said that they were, yes. So take that for what you will, but
and then take Jason Kenney for what you will.
Yeah, some discord between Ottawa and the provincial government. Tim, what do you think was behind this decision, and what do you think it does to that relationship between the province and Ottawa?
Well, as mentioned before, our company does some work with Teck Resources. I wasn't privy to the conversations the Premier is talking about that Kathleen just mentioned. So I can't comment on the specifics of that, and I'm not going to speak for Teck, obviously. But to answer your question, I'm sitting here in an oil-producing province. As you and Kathleen both know, Vashi, of those 7,000 jobs, a hell of a lot of them probably would have gone to Newfoundlanders who go to Alberta to work. So the pain is being felt here in Newfoundland and Labrador as well as in Alberta, not as acutely as in Alberta. But I would say this, and I think you and others have been highlighting it. Take Don Lindsay's letter, the CEO of Teck, as it's written. And the key point in that letter, I would suggest to you, is the acrimony, and that's my word, that he talks about in the political climate, that I'm talking about in the political climate, is not just restricted to one particular government. I think...
Let me read the section really quickly for our viewers.
Yep.
The promise of Canada's potential will not be realized until governments can reach agreement around how climate policy considerations will be addressed in the context of future responsible energy sector development. Without clarity on this critical question, the situation that has faced Frontier will be faced by future projects, and it will be very difficult to attract future investment, either domestic or foreign.
Yeah, and so I think there's lots of blame to go around, and it's not just the federal and provincial government. There are all sorts of groups with different angles that use the Teck Frontier project for their own, advancing their own particular issues. We can't be naive enough to think the blame rests with one side, and if we do, that's part of the problem. I would argue this. Look, we've seen enough insults, we've seen enough shouting, and God forbid, we've seen enough Paw Patrol videos from the leader of the opposition to recognize that if we're ever going to get resource projects done in this country of the magnitude of Frontier, we're going to need a lot more maturity and cooperation than hand-to-hand combat over who's to blame.
You know, it's interesting, and Yolanda, I'll get your take on this. That's what struck me too, because it's not just actually this letter from Don Lindsay. We'll get into it a bit later when we talk about the carbon tax. But the recognition of that acrimony between levels of governments where this specific discussion is concerned is actually also cited in the conclusion of the court decision rendered by the Alberta Court of Appeal today as well. And so you sit back and you think in the afternoon, okay, well, how will this be heeded by those levels of government? And then you just do interviews with both the federal government and the provincial government, and you realize it wasn't heeded at all. In fact, the rhetoric is just as inflamed, if not more. And in question period, we saw examples on all sides of that too. So I'm wondering, Yolande, how depressed should I be about that?
Well, I think,
but sort of, is it just because they all have something politically to gain for themselves that they're like this?
Well, at the end of the day, maybe in the short term, in terms of if you're going to think of politics in terms of winning the day, I guess you can see it that way. But I don't want to encourage you to be more depressed. But I think that in some manner, whether it's the Frontier decision or even the appeals court's decision, as you were citing the end of the climate, the acrimony as described, we're going to have to come out of this circle or this square where it's either we continue to pump all of our resources out in pipelines, or there are no pipelines at all, and we just need to cut everything. This whole discourse of trying to come to a place of compromise, it seems like we are not just within political parties, but it's felt on the ground as well in different, within different protests and whatnot, that we can't seem to, even for any government, and we saw that when even the Trans Mountain was first, pipeline was first proposed with the carbon tax at the same time, there's almost like there's no political move for that to happen. And that has to, if we want the country to move forward.
Brad, what do you think? Is there the possibility of compromise? And actually what Yolande just said reminded me of last night I tweeted the letter from Don Lindsay, and the retweets from various politicians told me the entire story. You had an NDP politician in Alberta saying this is entirely Kenney's fault, a federal Conservative MP saying this is entirely the federal government's fault, an environmentalist saying, hallelujah, this is the best decision. Like every possible interpretation of this letter, Brad, I guess left me wondering, like Yolande, and after seeing what happened today, whether that idea of compromise is possible, or will this be sort of a binary discussion going forward?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more difficult. But what I found interesting about the letter, and I completely agree with Tim's assessment, that is, never before have we seen a company, at least I haven't seen a company come out with such a fulsome explanation as to a decision that it made. When TMX sold the pipeline, I don't remember seeing such a fulsome description as to what motivated its decision to unload the pipeline. So I think it's significant not only for its length, but for what it says. And that is, the politicians are fighting over, whatever advantages their particular position at the time. And the Conservatives in Alberta and the Conservatives in Ottawa like to say, what brings investment to Canada? Well, here we have a company that's actually saying, we support, the very progressive, carbon pricing and the cap on oil sands emissions. They were quite prescriptive in their letter from last night. That's fascinating. Now, will industry play a larger role in almost refereeing the acrimony, or will it turtle? In other jurisdictions, and they're right, other jurisdictions don't have the level of discussion that we have in Canada. That capital is going to other places. When we stop one project, it just goes to other places that don't have prices on carbon, or don't have labor laws, or don't have the environmental assessments that Canada has. So we're going to have to make the decision. Are we going to extract our natural resources? And if so, I don't think anybody's arguing that we have no rules on it. And obviously today's court ruling, which we're going to talk more about, is going to add not only to the timeline, but to the discussion as to who actually has a fundamental say in whether or not these projects go forward.
Randy, I'll give the last word in this segment to you.
Yeah, so in regards to, I guess, the impacts on the Indigenous communities along the in the area of that northern Alberta, from what I understand, there was last-minute negotiations happening this weekend between Premier Kenney and the chief of the Athabasca Fort Chipewyan First Nation, Alan Adam. They came to an unprecedented, I guess, deal. And Chief Adam announced his, full support, of the product. The chief has historically been, opposed to environmental development. So I know that Chief Adam was surprised, and he expressed, profound disappointment when he heard about that. And I'm told that, the other Indigenous communities, the 14 that are impacted in that area, are also expressing that disappointment. And one of the First Nations that is a little farther downstream, Smith Landing, the chief there was praising the decision, saying that, this was a win for, for the land and the water and the animals and the future of their community.
It was a decision that wasn't going to be easy for Cabinet, with so much of Liberal caucus opposed to the proposed Teck Frontier mine. But now the feds are off the hook. Teck Resources suddenly pulled its application for the Frontier oil sands mine. Here's what you need to know about the project. The location of the proposed mine was in northeastern Alberta, about 110 kilometers north of Fort McMurray. It would have cost $20 billion to build. Once in operation, it would pump out 260,000 barrels of oil a day. During construction, the company behind the project, Teck Resources, said it would create 7,000 jobs, and an additional 2,500 jobs would be required to run the mine for an estimated lifespan of 41 years. The company anticipated about $70 billion in government revenue from the mine. The environmental impact of the project would have been big too, 4.1 million tons of carbon every year, the equivalent of about 1 million new cars on the road. Earlier, we spoke with Alberta's Environment Minister, Jason Nixon, but we want to get more reaction from the province. Rachel Notley is the Alberta's NDP leader, and she joins us now from Calgary. Hi, Ms. Notley. Thanks for coming back on the show. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you.
So I listened. Oh, thank you. I listened to your comments earlier today on this decision, and you were very resolutely pointing the finger at Jason Kenney and his government, saying blame lies with him. I want to read a part of the letter from Don Lindsay, though, the Teck CEO. The promise of Canada's potential will not be realized until governments can reach agreement around how climate policy considerations will be addressed in the context of future responsible energy sector development. Is it just Jason Kenney's government that deserves the blame here, or should that blame be shared?
Well, what I would argue is that we had in place under our government a comprehensive framework for doing exactly what Don Lindsay was calling for. He was talking about a framework within which you reconcile sustainable and responsible non-renewable resource development with the obvious need to take real concrete action to combat climate change. That is what we were doing within our climate leadership plan, something that, of course, Jason Kenney ripped up almost as soon as he got elected. One of the key parts of that, for instance, was the emissions cap. And Jason Kenney's environment minister was waffling on whether they were ever going to actually enforce that emissions cap up to 6 days ago. So that kind of instability and uncertainty is exactly the kind of thing that is making investors concerned. We were able to go to international investors and in fact did that for 3 years and say, look, here's our framework. This is what it looks like. The federal government has looked at it. They're on board with it. You can count on this. And then these guys got elected and basically, for all intents and purposes, developed a very hostile stance towards any efforts that were of significance to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's created the problem that we have now.
If I recall, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, you did implement the carbon tax in that plan, but when things were not going well with TMX, you said, well, we're not going to have it rise to the degree that the federal government has set out. And even though you had that plan in place, you still didn't get the desired outcome, and that was for TMX to be built. Obviously, things have changed since then, but at the time, you were expressing a lot of frustration with the federal government, too.
Well, at that time, to be clear, TMX has gone ahead, and the federal government did work pretty collaboratively with us on getting TMX to go ahead. And the delay with respect to TMX wasn't about whether the federal government accepted our climate leadership plan or not. It was about the level of consultation that had occurred with Indigenous people by both the Harper government as well as subsequently round one by the Trudeau Liberals. So that's where the delay with TMX was, but of course, we're all sort of on the same page with that now as governments, and so that's going ahead as was planned. But part of that was, of course, for Alberta to also be the leader that we were on engaging a comprehensive aggressive plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to work with industry the way we were, and to make real progress. And as I've said before, not only has Jason Kenney ripped that up, not only was his environment minister unsure about what parts of it they would enforce in terms of that which remained, but they've also, of course, embarked upon a ridiculous attack on anybody who raises the issue of climate change for a matter of discussion. And so there's this polarization on this issue within Canada, I would argue primarily led by the Premier of Alberta, and that's creating a level of uncertainty not only in Alberta but across the country.
To be fair, where the emissions cap is concerned, when you were Premier, your government introduced it, you didn't attach regulations or didn't implement regulations so that it would be enforceable.
We were working on it, and we would have. And to be quite honest, I think had we been reelected, there was not a soul in the world that believed we wouldn't have done it. Whereas the new government immediately started sending signals that they weren't sure.
The Premier campaigned very explicitly on a rejection of many of the environmental policies that you pursued, and he won a resounding victory. Mm-hmm. Is it, I take your point on sort of what his policy might have or might not have contributed to the current sort of impasse, but the people of Alberta spoke, right?
Well, they did, and there's no question, and we've talked about this before, that certainly, for instance, with respect to the climate leadership efforts that we put in place, we might want to go back and think about how we deal with rural Alberta more responsibly than we did in the first round, if we ever got that opportunity again. But bear in mind, Jason Kenney also ran on jobs economy pipelines, and since he's been elected, we've lost 50,000 jobs. He also signed a public health guarantee, and he just broke an agreement with the doctors and is talking about shutting down significant health services across the province, particularly in rural Alberta. So, you know, as politics unfold, so too do these positions.
His argument, though, where the carbon tax is concerned, was just substantiated by the Alberta Court of Appeal.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think, to be clear, I always think that a province should assert its jurisdiction as broadly and as effectively as it can. That's why we were always supporters of the Made in Alberta climate leadership plan that we put in place, one that I think is actually more robust than even what the federal government is asking for, and ultimately one that would have brought down emissions faster. But at the end of the day, we also know, as your previous commentators were suggesting, that this is still going to go ahead to the Supreme Court of Canada. And in the meantime, the reality is that most investors have no idea what to expect from this Alberta government because they aren't particularly interested in establishing clear rules that will set a level reliable playing field for people who want to still invest in our oil and gas resources. And the fact of the matter is that our Premier, with the kind of attacks that he's rendered on anybody talking about combating climate change, has undercut our ability to assert ourselves as the most progressive oil and gas producer in the world.
We were just talking also with the panel about sort of the rhetoric from all sides right now, the federal government, the provincial government in Alberta. You are very critical of Premier Kenney. You know, as I said, you're lying this whole thing at his feet. Do you bear some responsibility for that rhetoric too? I mean, everybody is so cemented in their position, it seems. I can't anticipate how this compromise comes forth.
Well, there's no question that there is a lot of work to be done to bring everybody to the table, and we do have to do that. But you know, it was just frustrating to me to watch the Premier today, and he's the Premier. I'm not. I'm the Leader of the Opposition. My job is to assess the Premier. His job is to get the job done. And he.
But isn't it everybody's job in government to try and get the job done when so many Albertans' jobs are on the line?
It is absolutely that. But the problem is that our Premier thinks that he's the de facto official opposition leader federally. And I think that it is true. We need to get everybody to the table. We need to come up with the very framework that was well described in the letter by the CEO of Teck. And we need to get to work on that. But you know, honestly, I will say it's not helpful when we have a government that's spending, wants to invest $120 million into a war room that, you know, attacks people relentlessly on non-factual bases and, attacks the New York Times and all the various things that they've done, instead of focusing on the job of creating jobs, understanding that the way to do that is to go to where the puck is going to be, not where it was. And quite honestly, international capital markets are telling us that we need to take this seriously and do our homework. And the sooner we can get started on that, instead of fighting about the homework, the better.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much, Ms. Notley. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Alberta NDP leader Rachel Notley in Edmonton. Teck Resources has announced it's walking away from its proposed $20 billion oil sands mine in northern Alberta. The federal cabinet was supposed to either approve or reject the project this week. Now, it doesn't have to make the call. But if they did reject it, at least one Indigenous group was threatening to challenge Ottawa in court. So what now? Ron Quintal is the president of the Fort McKay Métis Nation. He joins us from Fort McMurray in Alberta. Hi, Mr. Quintal. Nice to see you again. Thanks for making time for us.
Good afternoon.
Tell me a bit about how you became aware of this decision.
Received a phone call last night or yesterday evening from the senior vice president of Teck, basically communicating the fact that they are withdrawing their application for the Frontier project.
And what was your reaction?
Shock and awe, to be quite frank. It was absolutely not at all the phone call I was expecting. We were so close to the approval. From my perspective, I thought Teck was perhaps inviting the Indigenous groups to Ottawa for the decision. Unfortunately, that wasn't the phone call that I got. I had a discussion that was much different than what I had hoped. And
what is your understanding of the reasons for the decision?
Well, in discussions with Teck, I think it's a combination of things. I believe that, the political unrest in terms of, the Teck being a political football between the province and the federal governments, Teck, being used as a lightning rod, if you would, for environmentalists, as well as the civil unrest throughout the country. And I think ultimately economics played a major role in this as well. Like I said, from our perspective, I attempted to request a meeting with Teck's board of directors for the purposes of having a conversation directly with Teck's board. Unfortunately, the decision was made and that opportunity had passed. So from our perspective, we kind of leaves us at this point reevaluating our path forward.
When you talk about the economic factors, do you mean viability?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of different aspects built into the economics. Price of oil obviously is a major dictating aspect of that, but as well as just the fact that any type of litigation challenges, judicial reviews on approvals, I think was ultimately one of the things that they just at this point weren't prepared to look at, and they want to. From what they explained to me, they're going to take a step back and reevaluate the opportunity and potentially come back in the future. But at this point, they didn't suspend their application, they withdrew it. So for lack of a better term, Frontier is dead.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you, do you feel that it is truly dead, or do you feel there is any opportunity in the future for it to come back?
Well, I think that's going to be dictated by policy. And I think that ultimately it's going to be up to the federal and provincial governments to come together. And I've been making a call all day today that the leadership of Canada and Alberta need to come together with the Indigenous leaders who are truly affected by this project to try to find a better path forward in terms of policy and legislation around that. And I think that's the only way that we as a country will move forward. With the attention that the protests have been getting throughout Canada, I think it's important that, the affected communities on this project have an opportunity to have their voice heard. And we need to seriously look at policy. We need to seriously look at legislation. At this point, I mean, we look foolish, and I think it's not the climate that we want to be in, especially when we're looking to compete on the world market within that context. So, from my perspective, I think there needs to be a serious conversation with the lawmakers, and I think that the Indigenous people of this territory need to be the moderates, the ones in the middle between the two parties to try to find some type of common ground.
Let me ask you, because this is something we've been talking about on the show all evening. Do you think there is any willingness or the political will on both the sides, the federal government and the provincial government, to do exactly what you just laid out?
That's the best question. That I guess the question that everybody's on everybody's minds today. I think that there has been a major will from the Alberta government to work with Indigenous groups around energy development. So I think that that's a very positive step in the right direction. And, the Prime Minister has made clear that there needs to be a balance. And I think who better to help find that balance than the Indigenous people of this country? We've had to be a bridge between between the economy and the environment. And from our perspective, it's critical that, something that's going to absolutely reverberate in this region for a very long time to come, because it isn't just frontier that we have concern over. This is any new applications, any new projects coming to this territory. I think it's very, very important that we take a serious look at this, and that's one of the reasons why I've been saying this is a national crisis, and policy needs to be addressed on this factor, because of the fact that we're looking at a major Canadian-based mining company walk away, a company that checked all the boxes, that did everything the right way, and they had Indigenous endorsement, Indigenous support, and yet they still chose to walk away because of the fact that there's so much uncertainty. So from my perspective, that's something that absolutely needs to be addressed, and why I've been calling this a national crisis.
Can you talk a bit about what the project would have, the impact, what it would have been on your community? Obviously, and I'm not trying to take away from a lot of what's laid out in the Joint Review Panel, there would be significant, obviously, carbon emissions and impacts on the environment. There are mitigation efforts as well that the company was going to embark on. But from your perspective, what would the impact have been on your community?
Well, I think, obviously having a $20 billion facility constructed north of you, there would be a number of impacts associated with that. But that's where the mitigation comes in. That's where the collaboration comes in. And that's one of the things we're successful with in the agreements, is having that built into it. From our perspective, we absolutely take climate change seriously. I think that, and there's a stigma out there that because we're working with oil companies that we don't believe in climate change, or that we don't respect the fact that the earth is changing. From our perspective, we absolutely identify with that. But in this circumstance, you have companies like Teck, you have other proponents in the region like Suncor, who are looking at the science behind climate change and agreeing with it. And they want to address a lower climate footprint, lower carbon footprint, if you would. So from our perspective, if the major oil companies are taking this into consideration, as well as the Indigenous groups take this into consideration, I think that it's time that Canadians take a serious look at this and understand that, there is an energy need in this country. We're trying to compete on the world market, but at the same time, we're prepared collectively to work towards addressing climate change. And from my perspective, from my community's perspective, that is something that's the initial work that we did. That's all of the 10 years leading up to yesterday's decision by Teck. That's everything that we had planned to do. So from our perspective, it takes the planning that we had done to date and sweeps the rug out from under us. And, it leaves us with a great deal of disappointment, to be quite honest.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but I want to thank you for your time this evening, Mr. Quintal.
Thanks, Vashi.
Ron Quintal, president of the Fort McKay Métis Nation, coming to us from Fort McMurray in Alberta. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.